Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on this week's episode is Jonathan Jacobs. He is a professor of philosophy and the director of the Institute of Criminal Justice Ethics at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. We are talking with a philosopher about our criminal justice system. So we're going to set aside politics and policy and dig into some of the fundamental underpinnings of our system of crime and punishment. Why do we punish? Who we punish? And are the goals we have in the way we punish working for us in terms of producing a population after prison that can actually re-enter society and be productive? Or are we causing more harm to those who've already gone afoul of the law? It's a fascinating conversation. Not every day we can sit in on this kind of philosophical debate, and I hope you'll enjoy it. It's been a great episode. Stay tuned. My guest today on Good Law, Bad Law is Jonathan Jacobs, who is a professor and chairman of the Department of Philosophy at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. So first of all, John, thank you so much for being on the program.
Very welcome.
We are going to do something a little different on this program today because we are not going to be talking about policy or a case or a piece of legislation or political dispute. We're actually, and I'm so excited about the opportunity to do this, by the way, we're going to be talking about the philosophy of the criminal justice system in our country. And in fact, we're going to talk about whether we have a system at all. That will be one of the great philosophical questions we will tackle today. But we start with the idea that I think is fairly well known to most people, which is that we have the largest incarcerated population in the world. I looked up the statistics this morning, and it's somewhere around 1.5 million Americans are either in state or federal prison today, with many, many more, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people who in some way are still connected to that system through probation or some type of release from jail or from prison. So we have a huge number of people in our criminal justice system. And you have written about this and study this and deal with this every day in your thinking and in your research about questions that I haven't really thought a whole lot about since I was in law school. So I want to get into this. I think it's fascinating to take a step back from policy and ask ourselves the great philosophical questions. Why do we do what we do in our system of crime and punishment? And how well is it working, and how could we reorient our thinking fundamentally to see things in a way that would improve the outcome in terms of the goals that we believe we're trying to set here? So that's kind of a broad brush focus for us. But John, I wonder if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself, because you have such a fascinating background, and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've come to not just philosophy, but the philosophy of
these
crime.
Issues. Yeah. After undergraduate school, I was sure that I wanted to pursue a doctorate in philosophy. I had grown to love the discipline. I had some very effective, very influential teachers when I was an undergraduate, and I realized I wanted to be a scholar. And I did go to graduate school in philosophy right after I finished my undergraduate education. And when I got my doctorate, and for the first really 15 or 20 years that I was in the discipline as a professor, I was mainly interested in issues concerning what you might call moral agency. I was interested in questions about voluntariness, and not just the voluntariness of actions, but if people's states of character are voluntary. In what respects might a person be responsible for the sorts of states of character that person has? And I was also interested in questions about sort of the status of moral considerations. Is there some respect in which they are objective, and how should that be characterized? If they're not objective, then what are the appropriate bases of moral judgment? But for many years, I was, as I say, sort of thickly engaged with issues concerning moral agency and moral reasoning. And in the late 90s, became interested in the aims and justification of punishment, in part because I was wondering about whether there are people who, on account of their states of character, are literally incorrigible, or is there always some measure of plasticity in a person's character such that they could be sort of reoriented even in middle age or later in life. So my interest in punishment actually grew out of my interest in moral agency and responsibility. And I began looking at this question of whether there are people who, on account of vices of character, are just unreachable. And if they are, should they be regarded as responsible for their actions? And that was my entry into questions about the aims and justification of punishment. I then was offered this opportunity at John Jay College, which is part of an enormous institution, the City University of New York. But John Jay is an interesting place in the sense that it has all of the departments of a liberal arts institution, but it has an institutional focus on criminal justice. And I don't think there are other colleges or universities that have that kind of feature. And so if a student majors in psychology, they'll focus on forensic psychology. If they major in the natural sciences, they'll focus on the forensic aspects of that.
So John Jay's graduates are going into law enforcement, they're going into the criminal sciences.
Exactly. They go on, as you say, either in law enforcement or security. Many of them go on to become criminologists. They do further education after graduating from John Jay. Some go on to law school. Many go into public administration of various kinds. The philosophy department there is, at least compared to departments like law and police science or the Department of Criminal Justice, philosophy is a small department. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was offered the opportunity there was what my role would be as a philosopher at an institution at which almost everybody else is a criminologist and probably trained in methodologies of the social sciences. And one of the things that struck me fairly swiftly, meeting new people and listening to colleagues give papers and presentations and so forth, was that it seemed to me people very often moved too quickly from an examination of the data to recommendations about how things should be reformed, how whole institutions should be reformed, how the state should do things differently. And so what came into view for me was the philosophical contribution can be to try to identify and clarify the conceptual and the normative issues that one needs to pass through to get from data to actual practice and policy.
And that is a perfect explanation for what I hope we can do in the next little less than an hour is bring to people some of the big questions that we need to understand and think through in order to understand how, not only how we're doing what we're doing in terms of crime and punishment in this country, but why we're doing it. So we started with a statistic here today. We start with this huge number of people who are incarcerated. We could point to lots of studies on the impact on those people and rates of repeat offenses after people get out of prison, and whether people should be in jail for marijuana crimes, which has done a big part in filling up our prison system in the last 30 years. But what I think we're going to try to do is ask some questions and think about out loud some questions that get at the heart of what this is all about. And it's hugely important, because I think if you don't understand that or haven't given much thought to that,
right,
you're really wandering aimlessly through this whole set of issues. You don't have a set of goals.
I mean, it's widely recognized by people across the political spectrum, people who otherwise disagree vehemently about many things. One thing many of them can agree on is that in recent decades in the U.S., there's been over-criminalization and over-punishment. And we do have a really pronounced issue of far too many people being incarcerated, many others, as you mentioned, being on parole or probation. The criminal justice system has connected with an alarming number of Americans. And it's not simply that, gee, there are far too many people in prison. The reason the over-criminalization matters and the reason the over-punishment matters in the way that they do is that if your political order is, in a broad sense, a liberal democratic political order, which ours is, the one, right? The UK is, I mean, the UK is a constitutional monarchy, but the political order is basically liberal democracy. There are a number of Western states in particular that, are plausibly regarded as liberal democracies. The US is certainly one of them. And the liberal dimension of that is that individuals are to have quite extensive rights and liberties, a good deal of freedom to decide to lead the kinds of lives they want to lead without the state imposing on them some specific way of leading their life. And the democracy part of it is that citizens have opportunity for a genuine participatory role in government by voting, by running for office, and so forth. So the liberal dimension of liberal democracy has to do with important values and principles about the sorts of freedoms that people have. The democratic aspect of it has to do with the kinds of participatory role that citizens have, and the way in which, if they've elected somebody who they feel has betrayed them, that person's term will come to an end and they'll elect somebody else. But it's because we're a liberal democracy that those numbers that you mentioned are so striking. In a political order that was deeply illiberal, in Russia, in Sudan, in North Korea, those numbers would be a matter of indifference. But they're not a matter of indifference in a political order that's trying to maintain itself as a genuine liberal democracy.
Well, those numbers would represent dissidents and
Exactly.
and disagreeers,
Political prisoners,
right, in countries like that. And just to be clear, when you say a liberal democracy, you don't mean liberal in the political sense that we talk about liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, but liberal in the sense that the 14th Amendment really stands as a beacon of that, because it talks about due process and equal rights under law for all people.
Right. Liberal, in the way that I was using it, doesn't automatically have the connotation of progressive politics. Right, or yes, you're right.
So okay, so we have. So I know one of the issues that has been a big focus of your work is this idea of moral agency, that there's a moral component to our agency or our actions, our decisions, our choices. And if you look back over our politics in this country for decades, we've politicized the idea of criminal responsibility. Richard Nixon was the law and order president. He was going to round up, people, and that was part of his political persona. Even our current president, talking about immigration and the problems our country faces there, has politicized this idea of the criminal elements, whether it's in the caravan coming up from Central America or gangs, who are among the immigrants. And there's a lot of politics in this, but really we have to take many steps back to look at what it means to be a criminal, to commit a crime that finds yourself among those 1.5 million souls sitting in a prison today.
Well,
and tell us about that, because that, from a moral philosophical perspective, what does that mean, and what is it in a philosophical sense that our system is attempting to do with those people?
Okay, yeah, let me go back for a moment to the sort of guiding notion of a liberal democracy, because part of that is that in such a political order, it's not the state's role to impose or enforce in some comprehensive, detailed, thoroughgoing way one particular conception of morality or one particular conception of how people should lead their lives. I mean, the law needs to be morally intelligible, and it needs to protect people against various kinds of harms and impositions on their rights. But it's not the state's role to make sure that every citizen becomes a morally fine person. Mm-hmm. The state's role is to punish persons who wrongfully harm others. And that's a much more austere project than trying to turn everyone into a virtuous citizen. And so the extent to which somebody is trying to be a morally excellent person ought to be up to that individual, but what is crucial is to avoid wrongfully harming others. That's what criminalization, I think, should most fundamentally be about. And part of what has happened in the last 40 years, and you mentioned Nixon's sort of law and order campaigning and so forth, is that in recent decades, both of the major parties in this country have got into a kind of competition to be able to claim that they'll be able to do the best job with regard to law and order, getting the bad guys off the street, protecting our children from corrupting influences, and so forth. Now, if both parties are competing in that way, there's a very substantial risk that a sort of democratic populism might start undermining some of the liberal principles and values. And that's what I think overcriminalization is mainly about, that the parties have been responsive to what seems to them prevailing popular sentiments about doing something about drugs or doing something about violence or doing something about whatever the issue happens to be. And rather than formulating policies and making adjustments in practices and institutions with a view to things going better, they've entered into this competition to see who can round up the most bad guys.
It is almost because that's something you can measure. You can say, I prosecuted this many bad guys, or I locked up this many bad guys, or look how I filled up the jails, which means I've gotten the bad guys off the street, which is what you said. But stepping back from that, is that the goal? I mean,
Yes.
is that the purpose of punishing a crime, to get that person off the street?
Okay, yeah. Now,
Because I think you've written that it's not. And I mean, my going back to criminal law with my criminal law professor in law school, Stephen Morse, I mean, we talked a lot about the moral underpinnings of our crime and punishment system. And
I know Professor Morse, and I know that he's able to approach these issues from an informed position in several different disciplines. He's got a very textured understanding of these
well,
things.
he too is very interested in the idea of moral responsibility and agency, as you say, whether we really are in charge of our decisions, and looks at things like mental incapacity and the defense of mental incapacity for certain crimes, and what does that say about, personal responsibility.
Well, one thing just to mention at the outset concerning criminal justice in the U.S. is that it's not a single overall coherent system. And not simply because there are federal laws and state laws and municipal ordinances and so forth. I mean, jurisdictionally, U.S. law is complex, but not in a way that's inevitably problematic. It's complex because of the way we've organized our political institutions. What is also somewhat confusing, though, about criminal justice is if you asked for a clear, concise answer to the question, why do we incarcerate people? You're either not going to get a clear, concise answer, or you'll get 7 of them, and they won't be consistent with each other. And that's because at different times, sometimes for about 20 years at a time, there'll be a prevailing view about what criminal sanction really should be aiming at. And it will turn out that that doesn't magically solve the problems that we encounter. And so some other approach will be adopted. There is no magic. Problems will remain. Later on, there will be another approach. So if you looked at the last 100 years or so, you'd find that there have been several phases where different influences were shaping policies of criminal sanction. But it never really involves an explicit, very clear project of replacing the prior view with a new view. There's plenty of resonances of older views, and the result is, as I say, that different constituencies, different actors in the system have different views, that some of them might think that we should be doing what we can to rehabilitate people so that they're able to successfully re-enter free society and be able to participate in a way where the temptation to crime is much diminished. Others believe that it's not the state's role to try to reform people's character. It's the state's role to see that justice is served, and that means punishing people in proportion to their desert.
Right, the wrong they committed.
The wrong they commit, and the gravity of that wrong. There are others who have yet different views, and so we not only have different levels of jurisdiction and different states trying different initiatives and approaches and so forth, there's just a sort of salad bar of views about what in the world should criminal sanction be trying to accomplish. I think one thing that just about everybody can agree on as being fundamentally important is that whether you believe it's the whole story or not about criminal sanction, desert is fundamentally important. I mean, it is regarded as a very, very serious wrong to knowingly punish someone in the absence of compelling evidence that the person is guilty.
Or even to find out that the person might have legitimately been thought to have committed a crime, but later from new technology
It's
like
discovered,
DNA,
right.
we figure out that they weren't. That's just about the greatest sin that can be committed
That's right.
in our criminal justice system.
That's right. So desert has a kind of fundamental significance where the controversies come in primarily is with what should the rest of the story be. Now, I mentioned about 15 minutes ago that it's part of my understanding of a basically liberal political order that the state isn't in the business of trying to make people morally virtuous, but at the same time that it's not in the business of making people virtuous, it has a very basic responsibility not to harm them and make them worse. And part of what is so troubling about the current scale of incarceration and the severity of many sentences that are meted out is that we know that we're worsening people. There are extensive empirical studies of what happens to you if you spend 17 years in a prison, and if you spend 12 of those years in solitary confinement, if you have no opportunity for sort of deliberative input in decisions about life within the prison, if you're cut off from reading materials and conversations with people on the outside and so forth. Unfortunately, many people think that instead of an offender being sent to prison as punishment, they think that the offender is sent to prison for punishment. In other words, to be made miserable and unhappy and cut off from the liberties and the pleasures of free society. And if there is good evidence that we actually are worsening people, that's a significant betrayal of basic principles of the political order.
Well, you use a term in some of the recent writings, which you sent me before our conversation today. You use a term that I haven't really ever thought about, but we do talk about it a lot just in our regular thinking about life, which is the word demoralize. We might feel demoralized by a personal disappointment in our life, in the sense of being deflated or really disappointed or upset about something that didn't go right. But you're using the word in a different way to say that somebody becomes demoralized, like their morality or their moral sense is being taken away from them. So talk about that a little bit, because I think, as you write, there's a difference between rules of morality and a sense of values about morality that are affected by somebody who is treated poorly in prison.
Yeah, and what I was looking for was a way to try to capture and express the most important aspects of how many offenders are harmed as a result of their carceral experience. And it seemed to me that a way to capture and express that is not just in terms of their unhappiness, their feelings of anxiety or hopelessness. I mean, all of that is real enough and of genuine concern. But if you really do live under a carceral regime of the sort that is found in many American prisons, if you live under that for several years, it will render you less of an agent, because the capacities that we have for deliberating, for weighing considerations in making a decision, for figuring out what sorts of values we should regard as priorities.
We call that making good choices in
We
our
call
family.
it, okay, right,
Yeah.
making good choices. All of that is a reflection of and the exercise of capacities for agency, for being a rational agent. And if somebody is in conditions and circumstances in which the capacities for making good choices and for planning and for cooperating with other human beings and for coping with challenges and so forth, if you're in circumstances in which the capacities for that either go undeveloped or are undermined, we really do make the individual less capable as a moral agent. And again, going back to the sort of framework notion of what sort of political order do we believe we should be committed to, demoralizing persons in that way is antithetical to the values and the principles of liberal democracy. If people are supposed to have sufficient amount of freedom so that they can figure out what sorts of lives they want to lead, and if they're to be able to become moral grown-ups by participating in civil society, if somebody is denied access to all of the kinds of interactions and challenges and opportunities of civil society, it's very unlikely that they will develop as a really mature, responsible moral agent. And aggravating the problem is that so many people who are in prison already have had limited opportunity to enjoy many of the aspects of participating in civil society. They either come from third generation unemployment or poverty, or neighborhoods that are unsafe, and housing is substandard, healthcare is poor, and so forth.
Educational opportunities.
Educational opportunities are very limited. And so if you've already had the misfortune of coming from circumstances like those, and then, because you've been found guilty of a crime, you spend years in prison, who do we expect to be releasing when that person is released? This isn't somebody who can just sort of get back into the metabolism of civil society the way that you or I would try to.
Well, you're pointing to another way in which the liberal democracy ideal is disconnected from reality, because as liberal Democrats, and again, that doesn't mean Democrats like Democrats and Republicans, but as believing in individual liberty, believing in the principles in the Bill of Rights, and believing in moral agency, that is, that all people can make decisions freely about their behavior, their choices, their views, and so on. If we believe that, we hold that ideal, we're all assuming that everybody has the same degree of free agency, of free decision making, choice making, but obviously people who come from socioeconomically disadvantaged relative to others in our society, whether it's education, poverty, employment, health, etc., or family status, racial status, those individuals may have less access to agency in the first place.
That's right. And so what we're faced with on a very large scale is the question of, well, what count as just deserts in an unjust society, or a society that's unjust in various ways? And actually, the expression "just deserts in an unjust society," I believe, is traceable to Andrew von Hirsch. Von Hirsch has been a very important figure in sort of philosophy of punishment in the last half century or so. And I should mention regarding this issue of people coming out of conditions of poverty, substandard education, poor health care, and so forth. If somebody is listening and thinks, oh, okay, now we're going to be told that what the prison system should do is become a combination of school and counselor and job training and sort of a massive project of reform and rehabilitation, that's actually, at least not my own view. In fact, it seems to me that what's most important is not that we should try to turn the criminal justice system into a massive project of moral rehabilitation. What we should do is stop harming people. That we know what some of the worst excesses are. We know what the impact of those conditions are on people who are exposed to them for many years. And to be blunt, it's just morally, and it should be politically, unacceptable for this to be going on.
So, for example, what type of conditions or circumstances are you talking, like solitary confinement, something like that?
Extremely long stays in solitary confinement. Just the fact that in many prisons there's massive overcrowding, and overcrowding makes it more likely that there's going to be a tense environment, more frictional interactions, maybe more violence, more intimidation and bullying as people try to protect a small space of their own. I'm not suggesting that every prisoner should have a private room with all sorts of amenities, but think about what it's like to be tightly overcrowded, possibly in an old and decaying facility, have next to no freedom at all. And this is how it's not just this is how you spend the day. You might be counting the time years at a time. There's a very disturbing level of sexual violence, and often prisoners who have been assaulted sexually become repeat victims of sexual assault. There are, far too many cases of individuals and gangs settling scores with each other in extremely violent ways. Part of this is that there are some very bad people in prison. I'm not suggesting that everybody who's guilty of a crime is somebody who's had the misfortune of being treated unfairly by the society. I don't mean that.
Right. Well, and there's a segment of the prison population that is beyond any redemption or rehabilitation or anything, probably. The most violent offenders. Those are people probably most people would want off the streets and be kept off the streets. But that doesn't speak to the vast majority of people in prison and the demoralizing conditions that you talk about, also run into conflict with other trends that we know about and you've talked about, which is the likelihood of an individual wanting to make good choices for themselves in their life as they get older. Yes. There's a big difference between a 16-year-old, 19-year-old who's in jail and someone who, is in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s. And what does that say about moral choices and and lost opportunities given the conditions that.
That's exactly right. I mean, that is the poor conditions in many prisons really does contribute to a very costly loss of opportunity in the following respect, which is most offenders aren't people who are thinking of being criminals for life. And most offending tends to go on when people are relatively young. They're in their late teens, they're in their 20s, maybe even their late 20s. But many people who have offended age out in the sense that they get to a point in their lives where the risk and the excitement and the possible prospects of payoff from committing crime, the romance of that has ended. And frankly, the lost opportunity here is that if the conditions weren't alienating prisoners, embittering them, underwriting a lack of trust in the criminal justice system and suspicion about the fairness of society, if it wasn't doing that, what it could be doing is contributing to and encouraging desistance. That is to say, if most offenders don't want to lead lives of crime, why aren't we doing what we can to adjust the conditions in such a way that they would encourage desistance rather than recidivism?
Recidivism would be repeat
That's
offense,
right.
someone who gets out of jail and goes back to crime. Desistance is some commitment.
That's right. A resolve.
An individual's commitment.
That's right.
Not to commit further crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's right. So the desistance would be a sort of individual's resolve that, I'm going to try to make a go of it without inviting the attention of law enforcement. Now, if you're released into conditions where there doesn't seem to be much support for making a go of it, if there aren't jobs, if you lack the sorts of skills that would be needed, or lack the education that would be needed for whatever work is available and so forth, I can imagine that it could become difficult to maintain the resolve about desisting. So, I mean, this is just a way of pointing out that criminal justice issues are not standalone issues. There are certain aspects of criminal justice that I think concern certain principles and considerations that are distinctive to criminal justice, but criminal justice needs to be seen as part of justice more comprehensively understood. And so if we were to try to solve the problems of criminal justice without thinking about the other dimensions in which a society and a political order should be aspiring to be just, if we don't make those connections, we are needlessly groping in the dark when we really do need to be thinking more clearly about how all of these issues are connected.
Well, I want to go back to something you said earlier that I've been thinking about as we've been talking, which is the difference between punishing somebody for a crime and punishing someone in the punishment for that crime. And I was thinking about, the way we think about the language we use to talk about crime and to talk about those who commit crime does say something about our attitude and practice of crime and punishment as well. So the analogy I was thinking about was the difference between guilt and shame. Where someone may feel guilt for something they did, but feel shame for something they are. And that I mean, and I think just without a lot of background in psychology or psychotherapy, we know that the feeling of shame is much deeper and much more damaging to a person's psyche than guilt over something they've done, because you can apologize, you can make amends, you can learn from your mistake. But if it's so fundamental to who you are that you are a bad person because of what you did, that is a much deeper impact. So that seems to tie into what you were talking about before, about seeing somebody's crime as an act rather than the
That's
product
right.
of a defective human.
That's right. If we regard an offense as symptomatic or emblematic of that person being nothing but a criminal, we are treating that individual in ways that are both terribly unfair and don't make good social sense either. And if on the one hand it seems as though, at least in some respect, desert is fundamentally important to punishment being justified, it might also seem, on the other hand, that if somebody has completed their sentence, that ledger is closed.
They've paid their debt to
They've
society.
paid their debt to society is the way we put it, even
Yeah.
if that's not quite what we mean. But many former offenders or former prisoners face lifelong types of disenfranchisement, disqualification that make it extremely difficult to function successfully in society. And that is a way of continuing punishment beyond completion of sentence. And that strikes me as a violation of proportionality about punishment. In other words, if the sentence was supposed to be proportional to the gravity of the offense, why do we continue, as it were, disabling a person in various respects for many, many years after they've completed the sentence? That's, I think, part of the prevailing social attitude, or at least amongst many, many people in America. I think there's this notion that, if you've been to prison, you are a criminal, rather than you broke the law, you were found guilty, and you were punished. Granted, with many former offenders, there might be good reasons for suspicion about their honesty, or about what sorts of people they should be free to interact with, and so forth. But in general, to just sort of heap disabilities on somebody after they've been released from prison it's not just a way of imposing on that person a kind of domestic exile, as it were, but it shrinks the civility of society. What we're saying is, there are millions of people who aren't full-fledged participants in civil society, and we think that's okay. That needs to be considered very, very carefully, I think.
Fascinating. What are you working on now? I'm interested in kind of where all of these strands of your thinking and your research are taking you. I'm just curious where you're going to be focused in the year ahead or so.
Well, one of the topics I've become very interested in is desistance. And I'm trying to do a lot of homework with regard to the criminological materials and empirical studies of this, because even though I'm not a social scientist, I try to be very responsible about not saying things that are factually crazy or very implausible. And as I say, I've become very interested in desistance in part because I'd like to understand as much as I can whether stopping harming offenders really would make a difference to recidivism and desistance. So the larger picture, which is a picture I'm developing in a book that's about 2/3 of the way through, that I'm writing for Oxford University Press. That book is on criminal sanction in the liberal polity. Can we achieve both justice and civility? And within that larger picture of criminal sanction in the liberal polity, I'm focusing on ways in which desistance rather than recidivism could be encouraged without having to make a huge scale commitment to criminal sanction becoming a project of reform and rehabilitation. For one thing, that wouldn't garner enough popular support to actually be implemented. And for another, if you think about it, even if there were very desirable types of reform or rehabilitation that we would like to try to make institutionally regular, the expertise that's needed, the training of large numbers of people that would be needed, one needs to think about, can we really do that, as well as think about how consistent is that with principles and values that we regard as fundamental. Just speaking for myself, I do not regard reform as an aim that should be central to criminal sanction, but I'm adamant about the wrongfulness of worsening people via criminal sanction.
Professor Jonathan Jacobs, the chair of the philosophy department and the director of the Institute of Criminal Justice Ethics at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. Thank you so much for being on the program. This has been a great conversation.
You are very welcome. Thank you.